This is tape number ET67 from the library of the Howard Thurman Educational Trust. Two meditations by Howard Thurman. This is side one, entitled The Blind Man.
Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. We are continuing today our thinking together about certain of the important insights from the rather ancient but very revealing sorrow songs or spirituals that were a part of the common life of our land many years ago. This morning, the song is built around a very familiar experience to those persons who are acquainted with the New Testament. The blind man stood on the way and cried that he may receive his sight. This is the theme of the melody. The song goes through many stanzas dealing with intimate nuances of desiring and aspiration, moving from the heart and the hopes of the blind man, thinking always that perhaps he might receive his sight. The setting is simple. The blind man, who has always longed for his sight, hears the coming of Jesus and his disciples. The word has reached him that this man, this Jewish teacher, is a great healer. In fact, that he has healed men who were sick. So all of the hopes of the blind man center around each footstep as the little company approached him. When they were within hearing distance, the blind man shouted that he might be healed. He wanted help, and he was sure that help was available. He was ready for this moment. All of his life he'd been preparing for this great moment, and now it was upon him. And in the story, as found in the New Testament, the blind man receives his sight. It is a rather interesting and exciting thing to be ready for your great moment when it comes. Sarah Teasdale has a poem about this. She describes how a lady was climbing a hill, and she was sure that if she could get to the top of the hill, she would get a view in many directions. She would be able to get her lungs full of fresh air. She could stand on top of the world, as it were, taking in the landscape in many, many directions. But, Sarah Teasdale says, the briars were always pulling in her gown. And then she suddenly realized that she had crossed over the crest of the hill and didn't know it. The briars were always pulling in her gown. And now, she says, all of the rest of the way will be only going down. Her moment had come, and she was so involved in other things that the moment had passed without any fulfillment. This is a part of the picture that is given here in this simple story of healing as found in the New Testament. But these early singers did a rather extraordinary thing with this song. You may recall that in the story, the blind man receives his sight. But in the song, the blind man does not receive his sight. The song begins with a cry that he might receive his sight, and it ends with the same cry. This suggests something that is very meaningful for us. What does one do with frustrations for which there seems to be no answer in the environment? This was the experience of the people who first sung this song. They had longed for freedom, but freedom hadn't come. Their lives were long nightmares of pain and frustration and disorder and longing. They wanted something with all of their passionate endeavor. They needed it. All of their life screamed, as it were, for it. But it did not come. What does one do with frustration under one's own circumstance in the light of one's own tragic fact? This was the problem. Now, there are many options here. One is that sometimes a person who wrestles with frustration in this dimension becomes deeply embittered by life. He broods until at last all of his bitterness becomes something that causes him to strike out blindly, as it were, against everything in his environment. As a boy living in Florida, one of the cautions which we observed during the month of August, for instance, was to be very careful as we moved around in the woods picking huckleberries or doing other things that boys would do in the woods, because the rattlesnakes during that particular month were changing their skins. They would find a quiet place under a bush, perhaps even under a huckleberry bush, and as the old skin peeled away and the new skin was being formed, they were very vulnerable, and anything that touched them excited them, and they would strike out, so that black snakes, for instance, who seemed to have a running battle with rattlesnakes, would run across the body of the rattlesnake very quickly, and the rattlesnake then would strike out in his blind fury and puncture his own body with his poison fang and kill himself. Now, this is the sort of thing that happens to us. If deep within ourselves we gather all the poison, and then it embitters our life to the point that we strike out against everything and everybody. Each person stands in candidacy to threaten us and to undermine us. We are embittered. This is how we deal with the frustration in our environment. We say that life has it against us, that all of the resources of life have conspired to trap us and to make our lives miserable, and therefore we will not spare anyone else. Any person who comes within the ken of our environment is liable to our vindictiveness and our poison. We make everybody pay for what we think life has done to us. Now, this is one way by which we deal with the frustrations that seem to have no outlet and no release for us. There's a second way. We may retire, detach ourselves from all involvements as nearly as we can. We may let all of the light go out in our eyes, all of the quality of vitality and meaning, even integrity, exhaust itself. We will just become ciphers, as it were. There is a picture that comes to mind of St. Gordon's statue in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington. It is a statue that St. Gordon built over the grave of the wife of Henry Adams. You may have seen it. It is a figure of a woman. Her whole body is draped in a kind of green bronze cowl that covers her head and all her arms. She is resting her right arm on the right arm of the chair. Her chin is resting in her hands, and she looks out steadily in front of you. As you sit on the circle bench about 20 feet away, looking into her face, you see that her face is without emotion. Her eyes are open, but in a sense they are unseeing. It seems as if all the tears of which she is capable, she has already shed. She is living, but not alive. She has exhausted herself in dealing with the problems of her life, and nothing is left but an echo of what she was before. We may do this with our frustrations. We may burn ourselves out so that nothing is left but the ember of what we were. Now there is a third thing, and this is what was done with it in the song, and subsequently in the lives of these people as they wrestled with the overwhelming aspects of their own environment. We may take the raw materials of our environment and bring to bear upon them the kind of creative vitality and power, hope, dream, aspiration, yearning, yea, even spiritual conviction, so that we can reduce our environment and the things that frustrate us to manageable units of control. We may, to use a phrase taken from the book of the man who is the founder of the Ethical Culture Society, there is a peace that we can understand, the peace that comes when we are sick and get well, when we are hungry and get food to eat, or lonely and find a friend. But the peace that passeth understanding is the peace that comes when the pain of life is not relieved. It is the peace that comes shimmering on the crest of a wave of pain. It is the spear of frustration transformed into a shaft of light. This is what these early singers did with the aspects of their environment that would not yield immediately to their demands and to their urgencies. The blind man stood on the way and cried that he might receive his sight. And life's answer to him finally was yes, as it will be to you and to me. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer.
This is tape number ET67 from the library of the Howard Thurman Educational Trust. This is side 2, entitled Heaven, Heaven.
The words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Thinking this morning about another of the ancient songs. It is one that has been desecrated many times because of the syncopated character of its inherent rhythm. The song is Heaven, Heaven, everybody talking about heaven in going there. This is a song which is rooted and deeply grounded in one of the oldest experiences of the human spirit. It suggests that no person lives in a society of which he does not or cannot approve without some measure of compromise. The question, therefore, is not whether there is compromise inherent in the living experience, but the question is rather, at what point is the line drawn? Now, fundamental to this notion or experience of compromise, of course, is the deeply lying and subtle experience with hypocrisy, with deception, with lying. Now, deception is an experience that is familiar to us all. It is one of the simple ways by which individuals who are weak undertake to deal with persons who are strong. A little child, for instance, knows that he cannot control his father's will or power or mind. He is weak. He is a little child, and the father is strong. The father represents, let us say, the power of the state in terms of control. So what does the little child do? He surrounds the father with little acts that are in themselves deceptive, not in any moral sense, but the whole idea is so to operate upon the father's mind, emotions, that at last the father will do what the child wants, as if the father thought of it himself. It's a very old technique. When I was a boy, very often in the woods, I would see birds and their young ones grazing or eating bugs in the dried grass, and then there would be the shadow of a hawk on the grass. Without ever looking up, a signal would be given in some way, and all of the birds suddenly would lie down as if they were dead, sometimes even taking dried grass in their claws and holding it. The hawk, riding high in the sky, blinks his eyes, makes a double take, thinking perhaps that he's had an optical delusion, and goes on his way to seek for birds who did not have enough sense to play dead. The cuttlefish does the same thing. When he is attacked, he releases out of a sepia bag a fluid that makes all the water around him murky, and in that murky gloom, he disappears, and the enemy that seeks his life does not know where he is. It is a very old technique of the weak against the strong to surround the life with subtle deceptions, which deceptions cause the enemy to look otherwhere. Now this is a very crucial ethical problem in human life. Is there a difference in the moral quality of deception when deception is used as a device for the saving of one's life, as over against deception when it is used merely as a device of deception itself? It's a searching question because it goes to the very heart of the issue of compromise. If I compromise because what is at stake is something which to me is more significant and valuable than my integrity, then does this make a difference? What do you think about it? How do you deal with the compromises within the construct of your own life? Now, there are several options that are available to the human spirit. One is to recognize the fact that what you are up against, the situation with which you are dealing, is a situation which carries inherent in it so much that is destructive, so much that is annihilating, so much that is demonic, that any device that you can use in order to frustrate that which is destructive, any device that you can use to frustrate that which is on evil bent or which is demonic is justifiable and has in it a quality of creative significance that honors the human spirit rather than despoils it. Now, this is one possible alternative. There is a line in the Old Testament in which one of the men of Israel, who happens to be an attendant on a king who is pagan, he has to go with the king everywhere, even into the temple of the king's god. And when he stands before the altar, the heathen altar as he thinks of it, with his king, and the king bows his head and genuflects his knee, the attendant, the Israelite who worships from his point of view the one true God, must bow his knee also before this heathen altar. And he says to his God, God, deal gently with me, be gracious to me, provide for me an extenuating circumstance, because thou knowest that I am in a difficult place, and I have no live option but to compromise indeed, but my heart does not yield to this compromise. Now, that is one possibility. Another possibility is to recognize the fact that you are in a compromising situation, and to seek always to keep the decision in an area that is not for you morally decisive. Now, this is very, very important. It involves a kind of juggling of the total context in which one is operating, so that always the decisive issue will not have to be dealt with except on one's own terms. Now, the third is finally to come to a point at which you know you cannot compromise. You cannot go beyond this point. Now, when you arrive at such a position, then your only live option is to take your stand, even if it means the loss of one's own life. What would a man give in exchange for his soul? This is what the Master says, and it is at this point that the question becomes even most crucial. Now, the final concept in this song is that in the presence of God, all limitations are broken down. The song says, when I've got shoes, you got shoes, all of God's children got shoes. When we get to heaven, we will put on our shoes and shout all over God's heaven, that in the presence of God, there are no lines drawn, no limitations, but the human spirit, stripped to whatever there is in it that is literal and irreducible in the presence of God, is honored profoundly and deeply. This, after all, is the discovery of the ultimate basis of self-respect. And once a man has this experience, he knows that he can abide anything that life can do to him. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer.